Okay, so here's the problem. We want to calculate the salary. The salary is going to be given by calculating, we inputting two values, right? So the user is going to be inputting the hours worked, let's call that H, and the hourly rate, which we're going to be calling R. Now with those two values, you're going to calculate the total pay, but before you get the total pay, you need to know the straight pay and the overtime pay. The straight pay is the amount that you owe the worker for the work that they do for less than or equal to 40 hours. And then the overtime pay is if they did work for more than 40 hours, say for 50 hours, then you owe them overtime pay for 10 hours. And the rule for that is it's 1.5 times whatever they worked for over the 40 hours times what the rate is. If the rate is $10 an hour, then the time and a half is going to be 15, 1.5 times $10 an hour, and that's what you see down here. So the question really here is, how do I calculate the straight pay and then the overtime pay? The straight pay is the amount that I owe for less than or equal to 40 hours. Why is this a problem? It's a problem because how do I figure out how many hours the person worked? If they worked less than 40 hours, then the straight pay is going to be that number of hours, say 35 hours times the rate. But if they worked more than 40 hours, then the straight pay is going to be 40 hours times the rate. If I had an if statement, which we can't use at this point, that would be fairly straightforward. So how do I actually do this? That's the question. So just let me remind you about some of the things that we saw when we looked at Boolean expressions in Python. So if I say that, say I have a variable x, and I say x is equal to 1, and a variable y, and y is equal to, say, 2. So y is equal to 2. And so I can ask a question, is x greater than y? So I say x greater than y, and the answer is going to be x is not greater than y. It's going to be false. If I say, is it true that x is less than y, then I'm going to get a true, right? However, we saw that when we use these Boolean expressions, we combine them in, say, arithmetic expressions and so on, or in string expressions, then true becomes a 1 and false becomes a 0. So for example, what happens if I do the following thing? If I say x is greater than y times 5 plus x is less than y times 10. Now, notice these things are mutually exclusive. It's either going to be the case that x is greater than y or x is less than y. So if this is true, this will evaluate to a 1, and that'll evaluate to a 0, so the answer is going to be 5. But if this is true, if x is less than y, it's going to evaluate to, that'll be a 1, and it'll be 1 times 10, and this is going to be a 0. So in this case, what we expect is, since x is 1 and y is 2, so it's false. X is not bigger than y, x is less than y, we should get a 10, and in fact that's what we get. But if now we say let x be equal to 20, so now x is going to be greater than y, and if I want to evaluate that same expression, let me just copy it and bring it down over here. Now when I evaluate, I'm going to get a 5, right? Because x is greater than y, so it's going to be 1 times 5, and this is going to be a 0, so that's going to be a 0. Right? Does that make sense? So we saw this in class. So now we want to calculate the straight pay. How do we get the straight pay? So the straight pay is going to be either what? Let's see. So the straight pay is going to be equal to what? There are two cases, right? One case is where the number of hours, remember H is the number of hours worked. So case 1 is where the number of hours worked is less than or equal to 40. And the second case is where the number of hours worked is greater than 40. And so depending on what the value of hours is, the straight pay is going to be either this times something or this times something. So let's actually see what the case is. Let's say we have a case where this is true. Number one is true. Let's say a person works 35 hours. So the straight pay is going to be H, which is going to be 35 hours, times the rate, right? Times the rate. That's going to be if situation one is true. But what about if situation two is true, that a person, say, works 50 hours, then the straight pay is not going to be hours times rate, because it's not going to be 50 times rate. It's going to rather be 40 times whatever the rate is going to be, right? So that's going to be if situation two is true, if the person works more than 40 hours. So now what I want to do is I want to calculate the straight pay in the following way. So the straight pay is going to be equal to either this thing or this thing, right? One or the other, right? One or the other. So it's either going to be what we have in situation one, which is less than 40 hours. So it's going to be H times the number of hours times the rate, or it's going to be 40 times the rate. 40 times the rate. But which one is it going to be? So here what we're going to do is we're going to put some kind of Boolean expression, and we're going to multiply that Boolean expression by this, and we're going to have another Boolean expression and multiply that expression by this, and these have to be mutually exclusive, just like we saw in the Python shell just a moment ago, right? So if hours is going to be less than 40, that's situation one, then that's going to evaluate to a 1 times hours times rate. And this thing over here, since hours is not going to be greater than 40, that's going to be a 0. And so that's going to count for nothing. That won't add in at all. That'll be a 0. And it's going to only, the straight pay will be this one. On the other hand, if the person works more than 40 hours, so it's not going to be the case that the hours is less than 40. This part here will evaluate to 0, so this won't count in, but this will count in, and it's going to be the 40 times the hours times rate, because this will evaluate to 1. That is basically the idea. And finally, the same kind of thinking goes into calculating the overtime pay. What is the overtime pay going to be? Well, the overtime pay, let's say the person works 35 hours a week, then the overtime pay is going to end up being 0. If a person works 40 hours a week, it'll be 0. But if a person works, let's say, 50 hours a week, then the overtime pay is going to be the $10, the 10 hours that 50 is over 40, times whatever the hours are going to be, and times 1.5 whatever the rate is. That's basically the idea. Work with this. If I give you any more, then I've solved the problem completely.